It's the real news. I'm Aaron Mete. A new report says President Trump ordered the firing of special counsel Robert Mueller in June. According to the New York Times, Trump backed down after White House counsel Don McGahn threatened to resign rather than carry it out. Asked about the story at the Davos summit in Switzerland, Trump called it fake news.
Mr. President, did you order Mueller fired? Mr. President, did you speak to fire Mueller?
Fake news, folks. Fake news.
What's your message today?
Typical New York Times fake stories.
Mr. Trump.
The New York Times story came out just one day after Trump had told reporters he's willing to testify to Mueller under oath.
Are you going to talk to Mueller?
I'm looking forward to it, actually.
You want to?
Do you have a date
Here's
set?
the story, just so you understand. There's been no collusion whatsoever. There's no obstruction whatsoever.
Do you have a date set, Mr.
I don't know. No, I guess they're talking about 2 or 3 weeks, but I would love to do it.
In person.
You know, again, I have to say, subject to my lawyers and all of that, but I would love to do it.
Would you do it under oath, Mr. President?
Oh, I would do it under oath.
Do you think Robert Mueller will be fair to you in this larger investigation?
We're going to find out.
Now, Trump's critics say that reports he sought to fire Mueller could bolster the case against him for obstruction of justice. Well, joining me to discuss is Marcy Wheeler, independent journalist whose website is mtwheel.net. All right, Marcy, so this news about Trump's reported attempt to or order to fire Mueller is getting a lot of news. Is it a big deal?
Yeah, I guess it's a big deal, but I'm not sure we know what the full story is. For example, who's telling this story? Is it Don McGahn? Is it Don McGahn making himself look good? Is it Reince Priebus, who happens to share the same lawyer as Don McGahn? So I think that the story as told, I mean, one of the details that I think is crazy in the story is that Don McGahn claims to have threatened to quit, but he didn't threaten to quit to the president. So who was the intermediary between him and the president that made this threat worthwhile, or did something else lead Trump to not fire Mueller, which is sort of what I suspect. Chris Ruddy, who's the CEO of Newsmax, or the owner of Newsmax, good friend of Trump, around Mar-a-Lago all the time. At precisely this time last year, he was saying Trump's considering firing Mueller. And that's actually a better way of getting Trump not to do something. And it was reported at the time that that's what Ruddy was up to, that he was basically going to the press and saying to the press, Trump's trying to fire Mueller and he shouldn't do it. That to me is a more interesting dynamic than this McGahn thing coming out, 7 months after the fact.
If it's true that Don McGahn didn't transmit his refusal directly to Trump, what do you think is the significance of that?
Well, we are hearing a story from people who want to tell the story that Don McGahn was some kind of hero. Why would Don McGahn want to tell that he's a hero? I don't know. I can think of a lot of reasons for that. Remember that Don McGahn testified late last year, for 2 full days. Like, he has spent more time answering questions with Mueller's people than anyone else. And McGahn himself has done things that certainly reek of obstruction. He seems to have orchestrated using Rod Rosenstein and Jeff Sessions to give cover to President Trump when he fired Jim Comey, even though McGahn knew the real reason was the Russia investigation. We don't know where McGahn was when Trump was putting out a cover story for the June 9th Trump Tower meeting. And so there are lots of things that McGahn did that raise real questions. And I think it's interesting that we are now getting this story now that Don McGahn is a hero who saved the rule of law in the country. I'd like to be a little bit skeptical about that, especially, by the way, after we now know that Jeff Sessions testified for a couple of hours last week. And Sessions could certainly testify to McGahn's role in the firing of Jim Comey, and that might put McGahn in a position of pressure or exposure himself to obstruction charges. And so that might be why we're getting this story.
All right, so Marcy, I want to throw out my opinion here and then get your thoughts.
Right.
Part of the reason why I personally have been so uncomfortable with Russiagate from the beginning is because to me it just looked like an inter-elite battle. And a point that stood out to me in this Mueller firing story was the fact that Trump sought to one of the reasons that Trump cited as grounds for firing Mueller is that Mueller had resigned his membership from Trump's golf course over high fees, and thus Trump accused Mueller to his aides of having a conflict. And to me, that anecdote just underscored the fact that this whole Trump thing, or a lot of it, is a battle amongst elites. And the reason why I think it's especially problematic is because the elites who oppose Trump are leading people to believe that there is grounds here to impeach him based on, for example, collusion with the Russians or
Don't say
obstruction of,
collusion, Aaron. Don't
okay,
say
or
collusion.
I'm sorry. Yes, this is a reference to our previous segments where Marcy
15
does not
meetings.
like, yes, does not like the word collusion, coordination with the Russians, or on obstruction of justice, where people are being led to believe that because of Donald Trump's, strange tweet, that he could be impeached for, or what he says in interviews, that he could be impeached. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Well, look, I think one of the interesting things about this news and the reporting from multiple sources that say, well, this is proof that Mueller is considering obstruction charges. This is proof that that's how Trump is implicated. There are lots of reasons to believe Trump is implicated in what I'll call the conspiracy on his own accord. Okay, so I don't believe Trump is exposed just for obstruction. But also, we know from other reporting, the special counsel's office sent a note to the court in the Papadopoulos case, in the Papadopoulos plea, basically saying, don't talk to us for the next 3 months because we're going to be busy getting George Papadopoulos to help us go after these other people. So that says the Papadopoulos front isn't going to move for 3 months. CNN just had a report that prosecutors have superseding indictments for Manafort and Gates, and that Gates is beginning to talk to Mueller's people about flipping. So 2 signs right there. In addition, Mike Flynn doesn't even have a status hearing, kind of a check-in with the court. He doesn't have any sentencing hearing, but he doesn't even have a check-in with the court until next month. And so all of these things suggest that Mueller is going to be spending time looking at the conspiracy issue for quite some time. So why are we convinced that he's done with Trump and obstruction if, for example, Manafort got a superseding indictment that was closer to collusion, closer to a conspiracy with the Russians, that's when you might see Trump pardon him. You might see Trump engage in things that also might qualify as obstruction in the future. So why are we at this point where we're thinking the obstruction investigation is done? And I would suggest, again, I think maybe other people are going to be in trouble for obstruction, like Don McGahn, perhaps, and it is a means. One thing Mueller could do is call up Congress and say, "Here's my interim report. Yes, the president definitely obstructed justice. Here's a referral if you guys want to start impeachment charges." That's not going to do anything. That no one is going to be impeached on an obstruction charge. But what it might do is it might lead Congress to back off. It also might give Mueller more leeway to pursue this larger conspiracy without worrying about pardons or being fired or what have you.
On the issue of the conspiracy. So as I see it, there are 3 main planks. You have the Steele dossier, which alleges that there is a well-developed conspiracy of cooperation between Trump and the Kremlin going back years. Then you have Papadopoulos, the low-level campaign aide who was based in London, and that's where he met a professor, Mifsud, claiming to have ties to the Russian government, who told him, Papadopoulos says, and also an Australian ambassador who Papadopoulos told also says, that the Russian government has thousands of emails of Hillary Clinton. And then you have, weeks later, after Papadopoulos meets with Mifsud, you have this music publicist, Rob Goldstone, arranging a meeting between a Russian lawyer Natalia Veselnitskaya at Trump Tower, promising to Donald Trump Jr. that she has compromising information on Hillary Clinton in her dealings with the Russian government. So my question is, are these stories not all in conflict? If Trump and Putin have this well-developed conspiracy of cooperation going back years, according to Steele, going back to at least 2011, then why is it then that the Russian government feels the need to go through these strange intermediaries, 5 years later, either Papadopoulos or Goldstone? And even if you put aside the Steele dossier, if the Russian government is going through...
As I will, because I've probably written more than anybody on the left about how cruddy the Steele dossier is. So
okay, all right. So you throw out the
solution for you is put aside the Steele dossier, because there's abundant reason to believe that fairly early on the Russians may have started using it to misinform people. All of the hack and leak stuff in it is weeks, if not months behind. And I've pointed out that had Hillary relied on the Steele dossier, which according to Glenn Simpson, she did in part, she would have had a false sense of security upon learning in May and June that she had been hacked, or that the DNC and the D-Trip and so on had been hacked. She would have had a false sense of security and not prepared for something like the WikiLeaks dump in July. So put aside the dossier.
Fair enough. And Marcy, fair enough. And let me just say that you have stood out amongst Russiagate proponents in dismissing the Steele dossier from the beginning. So fair enough. So let me ask you then, what about the conflict between the Papadopoulos story and the Goldstone story, or at least the apparent conflict in my view, which is that in March and April, you have this professor, Mifsud, talking to Papadopoulos in London about hacked emails on behalf, purportedly, of the Russian government. At least that's what Papadopoulos says, Mifsud says. Mm-hmm. And then, so if that happened, then why weeks later does the Russian government go through this whole other kooky intermediary, Rob Goldstone, a music publicist, in June at Trump Tower? And by the way, not promising hacked emails, but promising compromising information on Hillary Clinton and her dealings with the Russian government, which had nothing to do with what was ultimately released that was embarrassing to Clinton and the Democrats.
No, Goldstone promised dirt, which is the same word that Papadopoulos was promised. And yes, Goldstone's just a music producer. He has said that himself, but he was working on behalf of the Agalarov family. If there is a long-term relationship between Trump and Russia, it's through them. They're the ones who brought Miss Universe to Russia. So he had the ability, and the Agalarovs had the ability to say, we want a meeting. That is what Papadopoulos was actually sent out to set up, was increasingly higher level meetings between the campaign and Russians. And what you had there is the campaign chair, you had the son and the son-in-law meeting with a representative of the Agalarovs, some other Russians. Yes, the public story so far is that they were offering anti-Magnitsky stuff, right? And that was the dirt. But I've shown in a couple of posts that Natalia Veselnitskaya and Rina Akhmetshin left that meeting. The other two attendees did not leave with them. And that we know that at least one other subject was discussed, reaching out to the contact day in Russia. But there are other reasons to believe other topics may have been discussed. And just 6 days, okay. Just 6 days after that meeting is when the first allegedly Russian stolen documents by Guccifer 2.0, those are the first that are being released. And after those were released, or after the hack was announced, the same music promoter, right? He sent somebody a CNN story on, and he's like, this is eerie, given what we saw in that meeting. So my guess is what Mueller has been doing with respect to the June 9th meeting, and I say this with great confidence, has been showing that the cover story, which is just about Veselnitskaya's push for the Magnitsky sanctions, that's just part of the story, and that the other part of the story is probably far more damning.
Okay, I got it. So Rob Goldstone offering dirt on Hillary Clinton's dealings with the Russian government, that could have been a cover.
No,
yeah,
Rob,
because that was the topic of the dirt. That was the topic. It was her dealings with the Russian government.
Where do you get that from? No, where do you get that from?
That's in the email. That's in the email from Rob Goldstone to Donald Trump Jr.
No.
I'll pull it up. I'll pull it up, Marcy. I'll read it.
Do it.
So the email from Rod Goldstone to Donald Trump Jr. that set up the meeting says, this is part of Russia and its government support for Mr. Trump. But what we often leave out is what I was just saying, which is that what Goldstone offered was, quote, official documents and information that would incriminate Hillary in her dealings with Russia, unquote. So that's my point, is Goldstone was not, he didn't reference DNC emails. He didn't even reference Hillary's emails. He referenced incriminating information or dirt on Hillary Clinton and her dealings with Russia.
Same word. Now read what Don Jr. says.
Don Jr. said, if this is what you say it is, I love it.
Okay. Then what happened?
And then they met. So,
No,
what I'm saying,
no. Then Don Jr. got on the phone with Emin Agalarov. So we don't know, and Don Jr. claims to not remember what was said with Emin Agalarov about what he was actually being dealt. So there is a chain of emails, including an email involving Goldstone, where he forwarded an email about the hack of the Democrats and said, this is eerie given what I saw in that meeting. So there are other emails that make it very clear that,
hey, Marcy, if I'm a kooky music publicist and I set up a meeting between some Russian nationals and the Trumps, and they're talking about having dirt maybe, and then a few days later some dirt does come out, I think it's eerie. But that doesn't mean that what the Russians at the meeting were offering was the dirt that actually came out. Well, Marcy, I think we've given our audience enough of debate, and we filled our quota. We filled our quota for the day. And as always, we thank you for joining us. Marcy Wheeler, independent journalist. Her website is mtwheel.net. Marcy, thank you.
Yep.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.